Hi there everyone! Welcome to this week's video where we're going to talk about Leibniz, monads, and pre-established harmony. I have a little bit of a different idea about how to present things for this time. There's so much rich material within the monadology and so many crazy moments of Leibniz, right? It's really fascinating and really difficult, and I don't think that we'll be able to cover all of the really wild aspects of Leibniz's philosophy in much detail. So I tried to think, what would be the thing that would be like the most helpful for coming to understand Leibniz's philosophy? And I think that it's really getting a handle on what harmony is, right? Harmony is an idea that emerges all the time in Leibniz's philosophy. He goes so far as to call himself the philosopher of harmony. So in a way, it shouldn't be too surprising, of course, that harmony is going to be an important concept for him. But I think it's really easy to underestimate how versatile harmony is as a theme or an idea. My main idea is that we need to be able to contrast the nature of harmony and the nature of identity, right? In short, I think you can fairly say that harmony is a way of talking about Leibniz's ideas, and identity describes in many ways Spinoza's ideas, right? So we need to get a grip on how is Leibniz different from Spinoza, right? He holds, is seemingly like Spinoza did, that everything about us, including the number of hairs on our head, including every decision that we'll make, and so on, are contained within our substances, within our essences, and follow necessarily from those essences, right? And so it can really easily feel like, and it felt like to many of Leibniz's contemporaries, that he really wasn't saying anything fundamentally different from Spinoza, namely that everything that happens completely and totally out of a kind of divine necessity. Now, to get a handle on how harmony and identity are different, think about harmony as a kind of weak requirement, a sort of weak requirement for an isomorphism, or if you don't like that word, a kind of analogy between two things, whereas identity requires that they be the same thing, right? So harmony, this idea in Leibniz's philosophy, is meant to describe a sort of expressive similarity or commonality that two things that are fundamentally different nevertheless have with one another. So let's get into some examples, right? The first one is a very simple example, right? A very simple mathematical example, right? Here we have an equation, y equals x plus 2, right? And then we also have a graphing of this equation on a Cartesian coordinate plane, right? So analytic geometry. Are these two expressions identical? Well, no, on Leibniz's account, right? Why aren't they identical? Well, one is geometric, right? It's charting, an equation in space, right? It's showing you an image, as it were. Whereas the other, right, is an equation, right? It's algebra, right? And so the nature of these two expressions are different, right? But they express the same relationship, right? Namely, y equals x plus 2, right? One writes that out as an equation, and the other graphs it. So these two expressions aren't identical, right? They're not totally the same. They have different features from one another, right? But nevertheless, they're in harmony with one another in that they express the same kind of mathematical relationship. Okay, here's another example. Here we have the song Mary Had a Little Lamb, and then we have musical notation of the beginning of that song, right? So once again, right, the song itself is not identical with its musical notation. We could decide to write the musical notation, for example, in totally different ways, right? And similarly, if you either someone just said the name of the song or even played it, right, that might not be as helpful for a musician as getting the musical notation itself, right? But obviously, in spite of these differences, we can see once again that there's a harmony, right? They express the same thing. They express that same thing in two different ways. So in our third example, we have here 2 + 2 = 4, right? This is in a base 10 mathematical notation, right? So in other words, for this digit, we go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 before we move over to the next digit, right? And so we're expressing a certain kind of mathematical relationship, namely 2 + 2 = 4, right? But notice that you don't need to use base 10 notation. In fact, you can use a lot of different base number systems, right? It's believed that we use base 10 because of our fingers, right? But it's also equally possible to write the same notation in base 2 or binary, right? And in this case, we can express the same mathematical truth, right, with 1, 0 + 1, 0 = 1, 0, 0, right? This expresses the same truth, 2 + 2 = 4, right? But it does so through another expression. Okay, now let's go with a more complex case, right? We said that it's the nature of each substance to be a subject that contains all of its predicates. Leibniz thinks it follows from this that substances don't actually causally interact with one another, right? It appears like they do all the time, right? But in reality, we can know that every predicate that a subject is going to undergo is contained already within its essence, right? So we are the cause of all of our own perceptions. Leibniz takes this idea even to its extremes, right? He's asked by one of his interlocutors, for example, at one point, whether that means that whenever you're wounded, right? Somebody sticks a knife in you or what have you. Does that mean that the monad wounds itself, right? And Leibniz replies, yes, you're finally understanding me, right? So everything about us, even those things that seem like they're the result of a causal process that it begins outside of us, actually unfold from our own essence. It follows then that your mind and my mind don't causally interact. Everything about your mind is explicable purely from your mind. Everything about my mind is explicable purely from my own mind. Leibniz expressed this idea by saying that there are no windows or doors between monads, right? I can't jump out of my own mind and then come to causally impact yours. You can't jump out of your own mind and come to causally impact mine. Now, does that make Leibniz a solipsist, right? And from his own perspective, what he's going to say is no, right? Why not? Well, because your mind and my mind, we are two expressions, two ways of expressing the same world, right? So the modifications that we undergo are synchronized with one another, right? That's why it seems like we causally interact with one another, right? It was, the synchronization created by the perfect engineer, aka God, right? And so it seems like I am coming to causally impact you and you're coming to causally impact me. But to the contrary, we're both unfolding everything from our own essence, right? But why do those things like agree with each other, right? So like, if you and I are in the same environment and I think it's cold outside and you think it's cold outside, like why do we both think that? Well, Leibniz's answer along the lines of all of the examples that we've gone through is that we are expressing the same world, right? We are genuinely different from one another. We have different points of view in the universe. We are totally different individuals. And yet, nevertheless, in spite of our individuality, we can express the same thing, namely the world, right? Differed according to our degree of power, which for Leibniz means our degree, our capacity, according to which we can clearly and distinctly understand the nature of the world around us. This leads to another way that Leibniz talks about his pre-established harmony. And in this case, we're going to talk about the harmony of the efficient causal world and the harmony of teleological directedness, right? Leibniz loves to use this example of a watch, right? A watch is really interesting for Leibniz because on the one hand, it's governed by entirely predictable, efficient causal laws. Each gear meshes with every other gear, right? And they communicate a degree of force to one another that makes them act in predictable, deterministic ways. That's one aspect of the watch. The other aspect of the watch is that you use the watch in order to keep the time, right? So on the one hand, there is this entirely deterministic, necessary, etc., efficient causal dimension to the watch, right? And that admits of no exceptions. There are no miracles. There's nothing that is sort of like, working in between the gears, right? Any kind of mystical stuff. No, it's entirely explicable, right? Entirely natural. But on the other hand, right, precisely because of its orderliness, right, it's fit for a particular kind of purpose, right, namely to tell the time. Leibniz thinks that our own world is like this, right? Our own world is governed by entirely deterministic, necessary, efficient causal series. And this is in particular how physical bodies are related with one another. But Leibniz also thinks that we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that God created this entire causal sequence to fulfill a purpose, right? Namely, the purpose of creating the best of all possible worlds, to realize the moral vocation of creating the best world that could possibly be, right? So let's get another kind of silly example, right? One is an image of a state, in this case, New Mexico, right? And someone could say the state that we live in, for those of us who are taking this class, right? And we both know that these are two distinct expressions that refer to the same thing for us, right? So once again, these two expressions harmonize with one another in the same way that the efficient causal world harmonized with teleological directedness, in my mind, harmonized with your mind, right? And so related to number 5, right? What's Leibniz's philosophy of mind, right? In a way, it's going to sound very similar to Spinoza. So there's no interactionism. There's no case where bodies cause minds and vice versa, right? Bodies just are appearances on Leibniz's account, and minds are entirely autonomous, right? They're determined by their own nature, right? So the question becomes, what's the relationship between our organic body and our mind, right? Why is it that when my organic body undergoes a change, that I feel that change in my mind, right? Or similarly, in voluntary actions, it appears like I impart a causal force into the physical world and act voluntarily, right? Leibniz's answer here is, of course, that God is the perfect craftsman, right? So the way that Leibniz oftentimes explains this is he asks us to imagine two clocks, right? The clock on my iPhone, right? And the clock on your iPhone. Why is it that these two things are synchronizing? Well, they have an external synchronizing cause. In this case, I think like all of our phones are communicating with whatever network decides what time it is, right? And that's why our phones or whatever our way of keeping time are synchronized with one another, right? So too, Leibniz is going to say that our bodies are perfectly synchronized with our minds because of an external synchronizing cause, aka God, right? Pre-established harmony. It's not that our minds are our bodies, seen in a different way, as in like Spinoza, but it's instead that our bodies are in harmony with our minds, right? That's the nature of the best possible world, the world that we live in. Finally, our last example, returning us to the central problematic of the theodicy, what's the relationship between God and the world? Well, it's not an identity relationship. That's what Spinoza thought. Spinoza just thought God was nature, Deus sive natura, right? By contrast, Leibniz is going to recognize that the world is different from God in many ways, right? Namely, that the world is imperfect, right? It doesn't have all these degrees of absolute perfection. There's evil in there, stupidity, a lack of clarity, all of that kind of stuff, right? Whereas God is absolutely perfect. So there is a fundamental difference here. But nevertheless, the world expresses God, right? We have to see how the world comes from and expresses the nature of God's moral vocation, which Leibniz understands in terms of God's effort to create the best of all possible worlds. Unfortunately, we have to end our Leibniz journey here, except for one little extra bit of Leibniz that we're going to start on doing next week. This is our last rationalist figure. Did you find Leibniz's philosophy persuasive? Did you like one of the other rationalists we talked about? I'm very interested to learn your opinion.